There is a ritual older than most religions that promises one thing and one thing only. It will bring back the person you cannot live without. No conditions. No refunds. No warnings on the label. A 24-year-old man in Texas performed this ritual alone, in his apartment, on the 11th night of a new moon, because the woman he loved had left him and he could not accept it. 9 days later, she came back. She knocked on his door. She said his name. She said she'd made a mistake. But his neighbors will tell you something strange. Not one of them ever saw her arrive. Not on the stairs. Not on the security camera in the hallway. Not in the parking lot. She was simply there, inside his apartment, as if she had never needed a door at all. Stay until the end, because what actually walked through that door that night was caught once on camera, and the footage still gives investigators nightmares. Daniel Reyes was 24 years old, working an unremarkable job in logistics in a mid-sized city outside Houston, Texas. He'd grown up in a small farming town 2 hours away, the kind of place where everyone's family knew everyone else's, where ambition meant leaving, and where Daniel had spent his whole childhood dreaming about a bigger life somewhere else. When he finally moved to the city for work, everything felt like it was happening at double speed. New apartment, new co-workers, new restaurants he'd only ever seen in movies, and 6 months in, a new relationship with a woman named Claire. Claire was everything Daniel's hometown hadn't prepared him for. Confident, independent, unbothered by things that would have scandalized his mother. She laughed loudly in public. She had opinions about everything. She made Daniel feel, for the first time in his life, like he was part of something exciting instead of watching it from the outside. For a little over a year, they were inseparable. Daniel introduced her to his co-workers as though she were already family. He picked out rings he couldn't yet afford, just to see how they looked. He built an entire future in his head, brick by brick, without ever quite noticing that Claire had stopped building alongside him. The breakup, when it came, was not dramatic. Claire didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply told him, calmly over coffee, that she didn't see the relationship going anywhere anymore, and that she thought it was kinder to end it now than to let it drag on. Daniel did not take it calmly. He called her 40, 50, 60 times in the first week alone. He showed up outside her work twice before she asked him, through a mutual friend, to stop. He stopped sleeping properly. He stopped eating properly. Co-workers began to notice him staring blankly at his monitor for long stretches, phone face up on the desk beside him, waiting for a message that never came. This is the part of the story most people recognize. The desperate, spiraling aftermath of a breakup that everyone has either lived through or watched a friend live through. It's what Daniel did next that turns this into something else entirely. 3 weeks after the breakup, walking home from a bar he'd started going to alone, Daniel passed a laundromat on Grant Street he must have walked by 200 times before. Taped to the window, faded and curling at the edges, was a flyer he'd genuinely never noticed until that night. It read, in plain black text, "Lost love? Broken bond? Spiritual restoration. Results guaranteed." Beneath it, a phone number and a name, Mother Alvarez. Daniel would later admit, in the only interview he's given about that period of his life, that he almost kept walking. He'd never believed in anything like this. But something about the specific phrase, "results guaranteed," lodged itself in his mind the way a splinter does, small and impossible to ignore. He called the number 2 days later at nearly midnight, half convinced it would go straight to voicemail. Didn't. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice calm, almost bored, as though she'd been expecting the call. Daniel explained everything in a rush. Claire, the breakup, the calls she wouldn't answer. "There are old ways of bringing someone back to you," the woman told him. "Older than churches. Older than most things people are afraid to say out loud anymore. But they are not polite ways. They ask for something in return, and most people are not willing to pay the price once they understand what it is." Daniel said he didn't care what the price was. He would come to regret that answer more than anything else in his life. The woman refused to meet him in person or take any payment up front, something Daniel found strange at the time and deeply significant later. Instead, She described over the phone a specific ritual, to be performed entirely alone on the night of a new moon, using nothing but a white candle, a photograph of the person you wanted returned to you, a bowl of salt water, and a spoken invocation repeated exactly 13 times without pause or interruption. She was very specific about one rule. Once you begin speaking the words, you cannot stop until all 13 repetitions are complete. Not for any reason. Not even if you believe something has gone wrong. Daniel wrote none of this down. He memorized it, obsessively, the way a man memorizes anything he believes will save his life. On the night of the new moon, Daniel cleared his small apartment living room, closed the blinds, and set up exactly as instructed. One white candle, a printed photograph of Claire from a trip they'd taken to the coast, and a ceramic bowl filled with water and a spoonful of salt. He'd looked up "New Moon Invocation for Lost Love" more times than he could count in the days leading up to it, cross-referencing what the woman on the phone had told him against dozens of half-credible websites and forum posts. Almost every source he found carried some version of the same warning. Rituals like this do not create love. They open a door, and whatever answers a door left open at midnight, on a moonless night, is rarely only the thing you called for. Daniel read the warnings. He performed the ritual anyway. He lit the candle at 11:47 p.m. He began the invocation at midnight exactly, as instructed, speaking Claire's name and the memorized words in a slow, deliberate rhythm. By the fourth repetition, he said later, the temperature in the room had dropped enough that he could see his own breath. In an apartment in Texas, in a month that rarely dropped below 60 degrees at night. By the seventh repetition, the candle flame, which had been perfectly still, began bending sideways, as if caught in a wind that wasn't there, though every window was shut and the blinds hadn't moved at all. By the 10th repetition, Daniel heard, very faintly, what he swears was the sound of fingernails dragging slowly across the hardwood floor somewhere behind him, though he did not turn around, remembering the woman's warning not to stop for any reason. By the 13th and final repetition, the candle extinguished itself in one motion, as though pinched out by an invisible hand, plunging the room into total darkness. Then nothing. Silence. The ordinary hum of his refrigerator in the kitchen. Daniel sat in the dark for nearly 10 minutes before he found the courage to turn the lights back on. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place except the salt water in the bowl, which had turned, without explanation, a faint cloudy pink. Daniel assumed, exhausted and half convinced he'd imagined most of it, that nothing had happened, that the ritual had simply failed. He was wrong. It had only just begun. For the next 9 days, Daniel described feeling constantly, inexplicably drained, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. He lost his appetite almost entirely. Co-workers who saw him during that stretch would later describe him as looking hollowed out. His color wrong, his eyes sitting differently in his face. On the 9th night, at nearly 1 a.m., there was a knock at his apartment door. Daniel has said that some part of him knew, before he even looked through the peephole, exactly who it would be. It was Claire. Standing in the hallway, in clothes he recognized from the last week they'd been together, saying his name softly, saying she'd made a mistake, saying she wanted to come back. Daniel let her in without a single question. For the next 3 days, Claire stayed with him almost constantly. Sitting beside him on the couch, sleeping beside him at night, speaking in a voice that was unmistakably hers. And yet, Daniel would later admit to a family member, something about her felt subtly, persistently wrong the entire time, in a way he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely, because he was simply grateful to have her back. She never ate anything in front of him, always claiming she wasn't hungry. She never once suggested going outside, even for a walk, always finding a soft reason to stay in. And every night, exactly at 1 a.m., the same hour she'd first knocked on his door, Daniel would wake up to find her sitting upright in the dark, perfectly still, facing the bedroom door, for several minutes at a time, before lying back down as if nothing had happened. His apartment building's hallway camera, reviewed much later by his older sister, never once shows Claire entering the building during those 9 days. Not through the front door. Not through the parking garage. Not through any entrance covered by the building's 4 cameras. There is only one piece of footage from that stretch that shows her at all. A single, for-second clip from the hallway camera outside Daniel's own door, timestamp 12:59 a.m. on the 9th night, 1 minute before Daniel says he first heard the knock. In it, the hallway is empty. Then, for 2 of those 4 seconds, the frame briefly darkens, as though something large passed directly in front of the lens at close range. Too close and too fast for the low-light camera to resolve into a shape. When the frame clears again, the hallway is empty once more. The knock, according to Daniel's own account, came exactly 60 seconds later. By the 12th day of Claire's return, Daniel's older sister, Marisol, had grown worried enough about his sudden weight loss and increasingly disoriented phone calls that she drove 3 hours to check on him without warning. She has said, in the only account she's given publicly, that when she arrived, Daniel answered the door looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week, though he insisted repeatedly that everything was fine, that Claire had come back, that everything was finally going to be okay. Marisol asked to meet her. Daniel told her Claire had just stepped out, something he'd apparently been saying for days to coworkers, to their mother on the phone, to anyone who asked. No one, Marisol would later realize, had actually laid eyes on Claire the entire 9 days except Daniel himself. Marisol did some digging that night while Daniel slept. The deep, sudden kind of sleep, she said, that looked almost like unconsciousness. A single phone call to a mutual friend confirmed something that made her blood run cold. Claire was not in Texas. Claire had moved to Denver 2 months earlier, had been seeing someone new for several weeks, and, according to the friend who had spoken to her only 2 days prior, had no idea Daniel believed she'd returned to him at all. Marisol did not wake Daniel that night. Instead, she sat in his living room,